Hello, everybody. Good morning to those who are here with us present in person, the privilege for us that we are seeing each other, and for those who are with us online. Welcome to the press conference of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. We're here in Bonn, Germany, at the meetings of the subsidiary bodies of the UNFCCC, the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there are many, and the subsidiary bodies have the task to deal with scientific, technical, implementation issues related to the whole implementation of the legally binding responsibilities of parties to the UNFCCC. However, and as you may understand from the title of our press conference, we do not see that the talks are moving the way they should, which could lead to a COP27 with no or small signs of progress towards a world of 1.5 degrees. So we have great panelists today who will help us understand what's happening here and what does it look like. What does the road towards COP27 look like? I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce yourselves briefly so people following the press conference can understand who you are. So let's begin. Please, Tetet, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Tetet Lauron. I'm from the Philippines, and I'm with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. So there are already a lot of scientific reports that provide sound and strong evidence on the causes and impacts of human-induced climate change. Rich countries and their corporations have been polluting the planet for almost 2 centuries now, and they owe much of their wealth to coal, oil, and gas-fed industrialization, with resources extracted from the global south through a colonial legacy of unfair trade, investments, and massive repression. Developing countries, civil society, and social movements have been raising the urgent need to provide dedicated resources and support in the face of the havoc on lives, livelihoods, culture, etc. in communities, especially in the global south. At the COPs, and especially here at this SB session, unfortunately, we are fighting for crumbs. If you will recall, in Glasgow, developing countries, we were asking for a loss and damage facility that would actually deliver on finance. But what we were given was a dialogue, a 3-year talk shop to affirm what everyone already knows, that mitigation is failing, adaptation has reached its limits, and we have entered an era of losses and damages. Specific to these SB sessions, we also see that developing countries are being pitted against each other. We all know the importance of adaptation and loss and damage. It is not an either-or choice for all of us, but to recognize that these are distinct in their own right. There is already a very small finance pot, and the discussions here are not to make the pot bigger, with the responsibility from the historical polluters and ensure that communities can access these resources to repair, rebuild, and rehabilitate. Unfortunately, at these sessions, we are hearing that this small pot is being lumped together. Funds dedicated for poverty alleviation, funds for humanitarian response to emergency situations, and funds for adaptation are being lumped together on top of, loss and damages. It is not even on the official agenda of this SB session, but we should also ensure that loss and damage should be in all finance discussions. Yeah? So there are now discussions around the Santiago Network on loss and damage. This is supposed to be the implementation arm of the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, to mobilize action and support on loss and damage. However, at this SB session and up until now, we see that negotiations are bogged down on issues around the structural design, whether there's going to be an advisory body, a secretariat, with rich countries insisting that the Santiago Network should be a light touch structure because it is urgent that they need to operationalize it by COP27. However, there is again that disconnect between what is the expectation of rich countries and developing countries of what the Santiago Network should actually deliver. Unfortunately, in the negotiation sessions, rich countries have been insisting that Santiago Network is a matchmaker. Now, it's only going to be a matchmaking facility to see what the need is out there and where technical assistance can come in. It is not even, the real resources that communities need, but technical assistance that would ultimately benefit the global north with their high-paid consultants jetting in and out of countries trying to assess the damage and the needs. So we very well see the divide between developed and developing countries. It continues to intensify. And many rich countries are in essence opposed to loss and damage because this is often linked with liability and compensation. But we need to remember, the debt owed by the global north to the global south is beyond measure. It represents centuries of unequal relations between north and south, between rich and poor, between exploiters and exploited. And countries that have accumulated wealth on the backs of the poor countries continue to refuse to foot the bill, both in terms of the actual cost of mitigation, adaptation, and especially loss and damage. Thank you, Gadir.
Thank you very much for that excellent explanation of what's happening inside, but also with the connection of what the negotiations have to do with the history of our world. Thank you, Tedet. Let's continue, please, Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Rose Jackson from Corporate Accountability. I'm going to speak a little bit specifically following on what Tet shared about the role that the U.S. is playing here in these talks. Because we have an obligation to make sure that the world knows what's happening here, and also to ensure that the injustice unfolding before our eyes does not remain in a bubble. If countries are not acting, we must, and if wrongdoing is happening, we must say so. So here's the truth of what's happened here. To put it bluntly, the United States is acting like a child who bullies other kids for fun on the playground, breaking their toys, pushing them off their swings, spitting on them, all while sheepishly insisting to the teacher that they're being kind to everyone and always being sure to blame others for the trouble they're causing. Except, of course, this isn't a playground. This is a planet that's crossing environmental tipping points at a rate even scientists did not predict, and that may soon no longer be able to sustain life. It's a planet full of people whose homelands are drowning and whose families are dying. These are not toys being broken, but lives being lost, millions of them. Why? So the US can hoard its wealth that it made off the backs of those in the global south, and so that polluters can continue to profit off a crisis that is killing. And except, of course, the US is not a child. It's the wealthiest country in the world, with more than enough resources at its disposal to be the climate champion it could be. And it's also the country that has contributed historically the most to climate change. So it has a responsibility to be a climate champion, not a climate bully. So why are we here acting like children? And I'm not trying to make a joke of things, to be clear, because nothing about this is funny. But hopefully this comparison illustrates the utter absurdity of what has played out here over these past 2 weeks. Here's what US bullying, in its classic form of childlike international diplomacy, has looked like over these past 2 weeks. On loss and damage finance, the US is rejecting any position that would do more than acknowledge the gap of loss and damage finance. It's blocking the effective operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage, and many more. There's this new backgrounder, which you can see up here, that many of us have just produced, detailing what the US has been doing to block loss and damage finance here. On Article 6.8, the US is insisting that using Article 6.8, which is on international collaboration for non-market approaches, to actually internationally collaborate to advance non-market approaches is outside the scope of what the Paris Agreement calls for. The US is also here failing to provide the billions of dollars it promised to the Green Climate Fund, let alone the additional finance governments acknowledge would be needed. It doesn't matter what the agenda item is, the US's agenda is the same. There are other questions that we have for the US, and we would like clear answers. Were you behind the mysterious rejection of the like-minded developing country proposal backed by the G77 in China at the start of these talks to put loss and damage formally on the agenda? How can you co-facilitate the Glasgow dialogue and insist to be truly impartial when year on year you have been the loudest blocker of loss and damage finance? How can you acknowledge a finance gap on loss and damage yet fail to do anything to fill that gap? And to other countries that ally themselves with the United States, ever ready to contribute to this elitist neo-colonial agenda, we have witnessed what is happening here. To the EU, Australia, Norway, and Canada, the US is a toxic actor in these talks. Anyone who associates with them is poisonous by association. Are you climate champions or are you climate bullies? We cannot idly stand by while the US makes a mockery of the millions of lives and livelihoods that are being lost. What is extra extraordinary, given where we're now at in the climate crisis, is that some of these lives are even in the US's own backyard, in communities of color, indigenous communities, and underprivileged communities. So it is not only demonstrating here that it does not value the lives of those in the global south, it is demonstrating its lack of care for those at home. Thanks to the obstruction by the US, we now have a very rocky road to COP27, and the battle to deliver the needed climate action and equity is our Everest. But we are determined because we know we cannot fail. The people will be and already are our own climate champions. In Paris, the United States did everything possible to make the Paris Agreement as weak as possible. Here in Bonn, it is now lighting it on fire. But we will fight for the real solutions we know we need and that people already have at the ready. We will kick out the polluters that have suffocated ambition at these talks, and we will demand the US and global North countries do their fair share and pay their climate debt at COP27 and no later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for being so eloquent and so good at describing the power dynamics that happen here within the negotiations in spaces where are supposed to be just and fair and looking after those most vulnerable. Thank you. And we have even more of related news in that regards. Please, Colin.
Thanks, Kadir, and thanks, friends, for those powerful thoughts. I'm Colin Basans. I'm from PowerShift Africa. I'm South African, and PowerShift Africa is based in Nairobi. And I want to take a second to connect this obstruction that you've heard that rich countries are playing in these negotiations to their real strategies outside, what they're doing with their own fossil fuel expansions, what they're doing with their own international diplomacy outside of these spaces. Now, as we look toward the COP and beyond, what we'd like to see is a COP where African priorities are put front and center. A COP that can secure real financing for loss and damage, a COP that can reframe the mitigation agenda from simply being about rich countries trying to shirk off any historical responsibility and bring everyone into the pool, those who haven't contributed, those who don't have capacity to do so. A COP that can reframe those priorities into one of real meaningful support for a genuine transition and real meaningful support for the countries who haven't contributed to this crisis. Instead, somehow what we've seen is that developing countries are the ones being framed as those who are the obstructors to mitigation. We've ended up in a ridiculous situation where despite 80% of new oil and gas expansion for the next 5 years coming from the United States, somehow we're being told that the countries with no oil and gas, the countries who need support to transition from that, are the ones blocking a mitigation agenda. Despite the fact that these countries are the ones who did it historically and are continuing to do it going forward. If we now connect this to what we're seeing with the EU's response to Russia. Russia has launched a brutal invasion of Ukraine and a wholly unjustified invasion. And the EU has rightly recognized that that invasion is fossil fueled and that they need to cut their supply, that they need to cut their demand of Russian gas supplies in order to have a just response to that war. Yet somehow, with that acknowledgement, the EU has decided that rather than transitioning and doubling down on renewables, they should simply shift that problem to Africa and are now on a dash for gas to secure new gas supplies from African countries. The German Chancellor has just been on a tour through Senegal promising real support for their development of their new hydrocarbon finds. And so what is insane here is that in simultaneously acknowledging that fossil fuels are the basis of an aggression, are the basis of a war machinery, we're again allowing Europe to turn to Africa as the dumping ground for those problems, to turn Africa into the collateral damage of their responses to the rest of the geopolitical situations going on. We simply cannot allow that. We cannot allow Africa to again be the one that is left behind, again be the one that is leveraged for European priorities elsewhere in the world. And we need to make sure that we learn those mistakes, that if we acknowledge that fossil fuels are funding war elsewhere, that we don't perpetuate that problem in an already fragile continent that has been ravaged by colonialism for hundreds of years. We simply don't have the moral legitimacy to perpetuate these problems again. Why on earth would we make the same mistakes twice? And so in the run-up to COP, what we want to see is not rich countries coming to Africa to be the dumping ground of new stranded assets, to come to Africa to be the new secure supply for their existing expansions. We want to see rich countries meaningfully supporting African priorities on loss and damage, meaningfully supporting African transition to renewable energy communities, to people-centered development models, and to break the extractive and neo-colonial models of the past. We hope that those in these talks who have continued to play a distractive role, we hope that they'll hear that message, and we hope that in the 6 months leading into COP, we'll see a change of tune. Unfortunately, if history is anything to go by, that hope is probably ill-placed.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that I would call a reality check and contextualize the dynamics in the region now that the COP will be in Egypt and in Africa, and for talking about so many important elements. Now, final wrap-up of final comments by Mina, please.
Thank you to all my comrades here, wonderfully eloquent. Just to say that, I agree totally, of course, more than totally, but I think the heart of the matter is really the hypocrisy of the developed world. The Glasgow Climate Pact, where they were all applauding, which actually, from our perspective, was the Glasgow escape from their real commitments and obligations. So they talk about keeping 1.5 degree alive, but if you look at the commitments that are there on the table, they are actually causing the biggest escape. And that is through this what's called the net zero escape. And they talk about net zero for everyone by 2050. And this is too little, too late, and in fact, developed countries have to have been net negative by today. So this is really carbon colonialism. It's not us who's been calling it. There are developing countries within this process who have called it, that they are actually carbon colonizing. And yet, under the mitigation work program, when they talked about a mitigation work program, they don't want to acknowledge historical emissions. They don't want to talk about the carbon space that is fast disappearing. They talk about the critical decade, but they continue their expansion of the fossil fuels, as Colin is saying, and they talk about using nature as carbon sinks in our parts of the world, impinging on our forests, impinging on our wetlands, infringing on really our own ecosystems, once again, in the name of climate response. This is colonialism at its heart, and we have to call out on that, and we have to see that for what it is. And apart from this great escape, they don't want to meet any of the commitments that they have signed up to. And we have seen the finance commitment, and they talk about the trillions out there, shifting the trillions. And when they talk about the shifting the trillions, they are saying that the private sector actors are going to save the world once again. And we know who is responsible for the damage that has been caused over the years. It is the very same private sector which is now reinventing itself under the guise of environment, social governance, this ESG, which is total greenwashing. And they come in and say they're going to save the world. Now, we have seen through these lies, and we don't believe them. And we have to call out and say, this is not going to solve the problem. Now, on the little steps that developing countries have asked for, it's really pitiful that, as Tetet has mentioned, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, one of the little successes in Glasgow, where it's about a technical assistance. And what do they want to do with it? They want to keep it outside of this COP. They want it to be in the hands of outsiders. They want it not to have any accountability. They don't want any advisory board. They don't want any oversight. So basically, it's about privatizing the Santiago Network, which is a technical assistance facility to address the developing country needs or loss and damage to the outside. So basically, they are privatizing all their commitments to the outside world, and they come in and they talk about limiting temperature goal to 1.5. Now, we have had it. And even on adaptation, the global goal on adaptation, this is a collective goal that they're supposed to arrive at, which was agreed at Paris. How many millions will be saved by a certain timeline? We need to measure that. We need to know whether there is a collective response to adaptation. But they are doing everything possible to not do that in a very serious way. So again, once again, everything is, we already have existing arrangements, the private sector will rescue adaptation, when we know that that will never take place. They talk about insurance. Insurance for adaptation is like asking a sick person to pay over and over again for your own sickness when somebody else has caused it. Now, these lies and these dubious escapes, we see through, we cannot accept them, and we have to denounce them, and that's why we keep coming to this space. People ask us, why do you keep coming back? Why do you have any, Colin said, the glimmer of hope is less and less, but I don't think we have a choice. These are treaties that they entered into, as weak as they may be, we have to catch on them, and we have to hold them to account for what they are not doing. Finally, on the global stocktake, we've heard, the one thing about this process is there's been a lot of talks, a lot of dialogues, a lot of talks, but no meeting of real commitments and delivery of commitments. We've had enough of talk shops, workshops, and more dialogue. Time to act, time to implement, time to deliver, and enough is enough of shifting responsibility to the developing world, particularly on the poor in all parts of our continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina, for being so clear in denouncing and explaining the hypocrisy that we're in these negotiations, but through the other panelists in the whole world today. We have some minutes for some questions from people who are present here. I don't know if the system allows for questions for the people who are online. Are there any questions?
From the press?
We can begin from the press. Are you from the press? Let's check if there are some people from the press here first. Are you from press? Please, could you say your name and question, and then we can go.
Yes, thank you. I'm Susanne Ehlerding. I'm with Tagesspiegel in Berlin, and I want to know if you are so angry, what does it mean for the outcome of COP27? So will there be strong obstruction about other negotiation strains if you don't get a facility on loss and damage? I mean, not you, but the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you prefer to take one more question or to respond that first? One more question? Yes, please, go ahead. Could you please say your name or your organization?
Yes, hi, I'm Larry Moffat. I'm with Rise for Climate Belgium. I have a question for Rachel. Do you see any change, any improvement at all between the Trump administration and the Biden administration? And would it actually have been better for the US to stay out of the Paris Agreement and not be able to be the bully and have this negative influence on the other countries?
Thank you.
And just a quick question also for Colin. Do you hold the African countries' governments at all responsible for the expansion of oil and gas infrastructure? I'm thinking, for example, of ECOP with Tanzania and Uganda.
Thank you. Let's go with the answers. Who would like to begin? Please go ahead, Tetet.
Yeah, on the question of COP27, we've been having some informal consultations and conversations with the Egyptian COP27 presidency here, and we do appreciate the openness with which the Egyptian COP27 has been speaking with a lot of civil society actors, etc., etc. So we've raised our concern, and they know our concerns around financing, not just loss and damage financing, but general financing. So the COP27 presidency has made it clear also with us that they would also want a big emphasis and priority on transformative adaptation at COP27. So we'll be hearing more and more about transformative adaptation, although I'm not quite sure what it really means in these spaces. But he also asked us to help the presidency raise more concern, more noise around the need for a balance around mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, because it cannot be one over the other, because everything and every action counts in all three work areas.
Thank you, Tete. Thank you. We want to hear all of you, so you have to be a bit brief. Mina, please.
No, I wanted to be specific on the Santiago Network on loss and damage, because what we see, we understand that the US and others are very silent in the room, but who we are seeing as the blocker is actually the European Union. And so we'd like to find out why they're doing that, because they've always seen as being much more magnanimous on their front. But what we understand is that they don't want any accountability of the Santiago Network under the Paris Agreement and the Convention. They want to take it out. They don't want any oversight. They don't want any way of... They want to control who decides what money and where they put that money and how that is done. Now, we are talking about the network here in terms of that responding to the needs of developing countries. So we have to have the needs taken care of in terms of developing countries really being taken seriously instead of the continued patronizing, condescending, not listening, our money so we can dictate how we want it run. That's enough. We've had it. So what we're saying is, if you're serious, if you're sympathetic, then what you do need to do is to actually have accountability with a party-driven, where developing countries have a say on whether that technical assistance is actually valuable, is responding to their needs, and whether there is indeed going to be progress, and not something outside over which none of us will have any accountability or transparency of.
Thank you very much. Major?
Just to quickly respond to your question about, sorry about that. Mic drop, I guess. Okay. Oh, thank you. To your question about if we're so angry, what does it mean for the outcome of COP? One of the reasons we're so angry is because the outcome of COP doesn't have to be what it looks like it's being set to be. Anything is possible. Look at the billions that was mobilized for COVID. Look at the billions that was mobilized overnight for the war in Ukraine. Imagine what would be possible at COP if just alone we stopped financing fossil fuels and put that money into climate action. We don't lack the way forward. We have the pathways to real zero, to real solutions. The money is there. We only need the governments to stop talking and start walking. And to the question about the Trump and Biden administration, here's the thing. The US has always been the greatest obstructor to progress here at the climate talks. It was more aggressive, more on the sleeve with the previous administration, but it is the same stuff, different day, and it always has been. What's different, though, is that Biden goes home and declares that it's about climate championship, climate action, which, of course, the previous administration never did. So we can't necessarily let the US walk away from the table, because that also means that we let them wash their hands of their responsibilities. What we need the US to do is to show up, do their fair share, play their climate, get serious about climate action, and stop playing games with people's lives. So I'll just leave that there.
Thank you. Colleen?
I'll try to be brief. Absolutely, African governments bear responsibility as well. And that's why millions of Africans have to waste oodles of energy, of time, of money, and sometimes their safety and their lives to hold those governments to account. The problem is that those movements are held back, undercut, and quite frankly, are spat in the face of when rich countries completely ignore what they need, ignore what they're calling for, and work with government elites to undercut their priorities and drive forward rich country agendas. So for sure, African governments bear responsibility, and that's why Africans work all day, every day, to make change happen. We just want rich countries to actually support and play ball.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for paying attention to what we have to say. Let's be angry. Let's be very angry because people are dying outside. So I don't see how I can be very happy here. We are very privileged to be here. Let's use that privilege to send strong messages here. Thank you very much. Thank you.